Awesome. So grateful to be with all of you. Appreciate so warm those warm words. And Barbara and I are just thankful that God has allowed us to be married for as long as we've been married. Certainly, it truly is just the power of God. And so, just want to say we're grateful that you are able to join us for what we're calling principles of thriving. And so, everybody who is married, we want to thrive. We don't want to just survive, right? And so, hopefully today, whether you've been married just a very short time or you've been married a substantially longer time, you'll come away with something that you'll be able to put into practice that will allow you to thrive in your marriage. And so we're going to cover a lot of ground. And so I'm going to send these slides to Chris and Megan and our notes. And so if you don't get a chance to get it all down, don't worry, because we're going to send all that to them so they can disseminate that to you. And this is part Bible, part research, part statistics. Just want to give us a number of things that we can use to really thrive in our marriages. And so
part our mistakes.
Part our mistakes too. That's all part and parcel of what we are. There's a lot of parts here. And so I'm going to give you a very familiar foundational passage to set the tone. And that's Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. It says, the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. We all know this passage.
One thing that we have to remember is that God created us as social creatures, which is why one of the reasons why, the last year has been so challenging for so many of us. But God's comment in Genesis 2:18 is true whether or not we're married, honestly. For years, it was implied that married people did better than single people. But the truth is, married people and single people really can't be measured in the same way. Studies have shown that it's the connection of positive and healthy relationships that makes a significant difference. Biologically, we are pack animals. That's who we are. It's just woven into us. And we are meant to exist and work together, and we need connections. Relationships are crucial to survival, for our ability to thrive, particularly our intimate partner relationships. Those are the most important. And since we are married, our spouse is our most important human relationship, and we have to treat it as such.
And I want you to think about this, right? So think about whether you're fundamentally encouraged or fundamentally not as encouraged about the condition and the state of your marriage right now. The state of your marriage, whether you are encouraged or not, the state of your marriage will influence every single major avenue of your life. Every one, right? Think about work. Many unhappy couples start choosing to stay later at work, right? Or they simply start putting things in place that allow them to stay away from home longer. But happy spouses that are encouraged about their families, they find ways to come home quicker, right? They look forward to that. They ask for a schedule that permits them to come home for things like dinner or whatever. If you are happy, you'll find ways to spend more time with your spouse. If you are unhappy, you're going to find ways to spend less time with your spouse. Financially, it's the same thing. When you're happy, you find yourself spending money on things that benefit your marriage. Or if you're unhappy, you're going to find ways to spend money on filling the void of loneliness that you're going to feel in your marriage. Your eating habits, your sleep habits, your relationships with other people. All these things, our perceptions about our marriage have some effect on every single area of our lives. And so the goal is not just to make it to the end and say we remained married, right? The goal is to thrive. And so today is designed to be very practical in nature. We want to give you a number of things that we can put into practice in order to improve the quality of what I call having better outcomes. We want better outcomes in our most important human relationship.
All right, so I'm going to give you several principles, and here's the first one, and that is cultivate admiration. Cultivate admiration. In Genesis 12, in verse 11, it says, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Okay, that's just encouraging right there, right? Who doesn't want to hear that. Not just I think, but I know what a beautiful woman you are. Now, if we remember this verse in the larger context, we realize that Abraham is asking Sarah to lie about being his wife. And that doesn't sound good. He wants her to say that she's his sister. And the reason, though, is because he's afraid that the Egyptians will kill him because he is her husband. Now, understandably, it's not good for Abraham to lie. Okay, we got that. But consider what's really just mind-blowingly positive about this. Abraham is captivated by Sarah's beauty, and he expresses that to her, even though he is utterly convinced she's so beautiful, the Egyptians are going to kill him, take her as soon as they see them together. Imagine if your spouse felt that way about you and shared that with you and others. Can you imagine that? Here's the mind-blowing part. Sarah was in her mid to late 70s at this point. Okay, what? The woman is in her mid to late 70s. I don't care how many years ago this was. People live long. I don't care about it. She was in her mid to late 70s, and he was like, "Oh, baby, you are so good looking. As soon as they see you, they are going to kill me if I know that I'm your husband." Wow, is that how we view our spouse?
Right. And what's also mind-blowing about this is that he does the same thing in Genesis chapter 20. You can go back and read that, or you're probably familiar with the story, right? King Abimelech, it's the same story. And if you consider this, right, if you want to sort of time date this, right, in Genesis chapter 18, God tells Abraham that in a year she will have that son that was promised. And what that means is that Abraham felt the same way about her when she was about to turn 100 years old.
Mercy!
Right? And so Abraham is cultivating admiration for his wife. He continues to express these feelings about Sarah, right? This is his feeling about her enduring beauty for years, decades. And this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, right? One of the things that research has found is that happy couples do this. They continue to cultivate and express admiration for each other as the years go by. And so I want you to just sort of take a moment. This is the interactive portion of our time together, one of a couple. And so take a moment, and I want you to write down the following, right? And the answer to this question: how does my spouse consistently express admiration toward me, right? Pick three things. Do you have three things that come readily to mind that you can write down about how your spouse will consistently express admiration for you, right? It could be work ethic. It could be your faithfulness, your sense of humor. Although, judging from what we heard earlier today at the start, that is suspect and highly questionable. But humor me on this. It could be that. It could be a particular talent you have, your kindness, your intellect, right? Do you have three things that come readily to mind that your spouse will consistently encourage you about, that they admire you for? All right, now as you're writing that, we're going to keep going because, cultivating admiration, what it does is that tells our spouse what we still think of them. Mm-hmm. Right? That's why it's important. It says, I'm still impressed with you. There's still something great about you, and I'm still noticing it. That is super important.
Yeah. And, cultivating admiration doesn't mean that there aren't significant areas to grow in. It's not all one or the other. It encourages the spouse who hears it, but for those of us who practice it, it helps us to continue to nurture gratitude for what we have. We're so fortunate. And if you want to keep the good there, then mention it. If you want the good to fade, then don't acknowledge it at all.
Right. Now, here's the thing. Next slide. The key indicator of divorce, right? The key indicator of divorce is the presence of contempt. And so what do I mean by that? Well, contempt is when you treat each other with disrespect, right? Contempt communicates, I don't want to actually be around you any longer. We're done here, right? I see no reason to be with you. Think about if you ask someone if they still play Pac-Man on their console, right? they'd say, what? No, that is so old. That is so yesterday, right? If they say that to you, it sounds like they no longer want anything to do with that, doesn't it? Right? What are examples of contempt? Well, it's when you respond to each other with sarcasm. There's a lot of nonverbal, actions associated with contempt. Loud, exasperated sighs, eye rolling, arm folding. If you're condescending with each other, if there's degrading humor where one of you thinks it's funny and the other one of you does not think that's funny, that's going to be contempt. If you're mocking each other, one of you says something, the other one repeats it back in a condescending tone, right? Contempt is the opposite of cultivating admiration. Now, keep in mind that you are communicating the lack of desire to your spouse and to yourself when you engage in contempt. And so we have to consider what we're telling our minds about our spouse, because when it comes down to it, we believe ourselves. And if you convince yourself that your wife or your husband is worthy of contempt, we are going to believe ourselves. And so what are we feeding our minds and our hearts?
Yeah. And that word contempt is so strong. We probably wouldn't want to use that and say, well, I wouldn't say that I have contempt for my spouse, but disgust, irritation, it's the number one reason behind couples breaking up, as Reuben said earlier, and it hinders any attempt to talk about the issue that maybe was just brought up. Your spouse might say, you told me you didn't want to be with me any longer. And while you might say, well, no, that's not true. I didn't say those words. Maybe it actually is true. We communicate in a subtle manner far more often than we do directly. And stop and ask yourself, if you know someone who turns her nose up every time you mention football to her, would you tell her about the most recent game that you watched? Like, why would you do that? No, because you'd assume that she wouldn't be interested. So if you roll your eyes when your spouse offers to talk about something light, then why would he go any deeper when you don't seem to be a fan of conversation with him?
You have to understand that couples start losing. If you are a couple where contempt is a feature of your relationship, you start losing the ability to talk rationally and successfully about crucial issues. But then you start losing that same ability to dialogue about regular issues. And then that results in one or both of you start feeling alone in the marriage. And you have to realize loneliness, not sex, not desire, is the main factor in why people have affairs. It's loneliness. And so I want that to sink in for just a second, right? Many affairs start when a person outside of the marriage shows more interest in that person than their spouse does. You never want it to be that your spouse feels like they are seen or heard more by someone else outside the marriage than by you. All right, let's take a look at the second principle. And this may be a little complicated of a title, but it's important to understand what we're talking about here, right? So the second principle here is what we call image versus instinct. And this has to do, why I'm putting this here is it has to do with when we have conflict with each other. And so how we fight with each other is very important. We need to fight like someone who has been created in God's image. And the scripture references, there are two there, Genesis chapter 1, the first part of 26, and then verse 27. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky. And then in verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And I want you to think about that. Hold those verses in Genesis in your mind, but I want you to contrast Genesis chapter 1 with these passages in 2 Peter and in Jude. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 says, but these people blaspheme in matters they do not understand. They are like unreasoning animals, creatures of instinct, born only to be caught and destroyed, and like animals, they too will perish. And then in Jude, verse 19, these are the people who divide you, who follow mere natural instincts and do not have the Spirit.
All righty. So part of what it means to be created in God's image is that we do not have to be slaves to our instincts. We have them, but we can cause those instincts to be subject to our will. And think of how often conflict takes us down to where we're simply reacting on the basis of negative emotions that we're experiencing in that moment. In the world, there are those who say, hey, you know what? I'm just being honest, just being honest. But what they're actually doing is not thinking about, or they're not measuring their words. No consideration is going into their words. A thought bubbles up and it just comes out. That's actually not really something to be proud of. Consider well what you want to communicate instead of letting your emotions lead the way. It's not a matter of being disingenuous, but looking for the truth that you want to communicate. Consider how we do this when it comes to other relationships. We do it automatically. We edit our thoughts perhaps with our boss because we're aware of and we're respectful of the consequences, but also respectful of the relationship. But here, I want to make sure we're also clear about what we're not saying. So we're not saying just sit on your feelings and don't say anything at all. That's not it. The message is not to stifle your feelings. We're also not saying just smile nicely and pretend. Both of those are extremes. And if that's where our mind is going, then it shows how much we need to really understand this point. What we're saying is to choose your words and think about what you want to say. What ultimately do you want the message to be that's coming from you? Not a desire to just blow off steam or blow off anger.
You know, in marriage, obviously, we experience both positive and negative emotions. And couples who are happy and stable and they maintain, what they do is they still maintain positive emotions during a conflict. All right. And so obviously a conflict is not fun. It's not desirable. But happy and stable couples, what they're able to do is they're able to maintain those positive emotions even in the middle of a conflict. Unhappy couples can't easily connect to those positive emotions during a conflict. And even after the conflict's over, they have a very difficult time returning to thinking about and being in touch with those positive emotions about their spouse after the conflict. And so we have to let go of our black and white thinking, right? Your spouse is not your enemy. Sin is the enemy. That's what we have to be totally convinced and truly convicted about. Lack of effective communication, that can be an enemy, but your spouse is not an enemy. Fear can be the enemy, right? Fear that you made the wrong decision, fear the marriage won't work, fear that you'll be hurt. That can be the enemy, but not your spouse. If you look past all those things, all those thoughts, you can realize that your friend and your partner is still sitting right there next to you, right there. They're right there waiting to join with you in order to solve what the problem is and to face the enemy together. That same spouse who you love and who loves you, you need to be nice to them even in conflict. Don't confuse your spouse with the enemy. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a conflict, because conflict tends to fall into two major categories. Typically, and you can think about your own conflict with your spouse as we're talking about this, right? Typically, what happens is either one person or the other pushes away the other person by being controlling, critical, or contemptuous, right? They have what we call the harsh startup. Well, why did you do such and such? Okay, whoa, I just came in to see how you're doing, and we're in it. We went from 0 to 60, right? I feel pushed away now because I feel that you are being critical. You're saying something negative about something that I did. Maybe it was something I tried to do that was positive, and I feel like it's never enough for you, right? And so conflict tends to either fall in that category or where one or both of you are avoiding each other, right? There's this sort of pursuit in the conflict. Talk to me. Why are you shutting down? I feel like you're not listening. You won't engage. You shut down and don't say anything, right? It's when one or both of you may avoid or refuse to engage with each other, and that causes conflict and really a lot of deep frustration. Just as much frustration if you feel that you're being attacked. And so if we're going to thrive, which is the goal of our marriages, right? We understand that conflict is not always avoidable, but thriving is about properly managing conflict. How do we have better outcomes? And what we need to do is we need to be able to talk about problems without criticism, without blame, and without emotional flooding. And so the question is, how can we bring up these issues that we're going to have to face, these conflicts? How can we engage in these in a healthy way? And so one of the outcomes, one of the things that has been shown to have better outcomes is allowing each person to take a turn. And so Barbara's going to share about how that's going to work.
Yeah, just to start out, even thinking about taking a turn, if we are doing that emotional flooding that Reba mentioned just now, it's like I'm thinking it, it's just coming out. But we're going to be in the image of the Lord. And so we're going to allow that person to have a turn, and we're going to take a turn. And so the job of the speaker, that's the first job. The job of the speaker is you want to describe yourself, don't describe your partner. So you can saying things like, well, you whatever, left the dishes in the sink, you, whatever, that's going to be seen as an attack. Really, the only reason it seems like an attack is because it is. But you want to state something about what you're feeling, not about who. Okay, so not about who, about what. The key is to direct your feelings towards the action, toward the activity, toward the event, the issue, but not the other person. State what you need. That's important. And this needs to be a positive. You don't need to say, oh, I can tell you what I don't need. That's not it. That's not it. But you want to be as specific as possible. This will really help the partner support instead of dealing with an attack. And it could be something that your partner did, that your spouse did that hurt your feelings, but you can still talk about the issue. I think when my weight is brought up, that really makes me feel insecure, and it makes me want to pull back and disengage. As opposed to, you know what, when you said, and you yourself or whatever, that's not the job of the speaker.
And we frame these in jobs because a lot of times in conflicts, we kind of get taken where the emotional, intensity takes us, right? We don't have a clear direction. And many times as I work with couples, they describe this feeling of, well, we started here, but we ended up here. And so framing this in the form of, this is the job that I have at this moment, allows us to anchor ourselves instead of being carried away with sort of the emotional flooding that tends to happen. And so that's the job of the speaker. The job of the listener is also very important. The job of the listener is to pay close attention. Now, if you're emotionally flooded, you're going to need to, in order to do that, you're going to have to engage in some self-soothing things, some self-soothing activities, and sort of calming techniques to keep from being engaged in emotional flooding. But you want to be able to pay very close attention. You might need to say, hey, hold on a minute, let me get some paper. I want to take some notes, not in a critical way, but I want to make sure that I actually know what you said so that at the end, I can then present to you a summary that you can tell me whether I am right or wrong or somewhere in between. And I always tell people, once the listener summarizes, start with, if you were the speaker, start with what they got right. Okay, that's very important. If you are the listener, your job is to pay close attention so you can summarize and say, here's what I heard. Is this correct? Right? You're going to ask for them to respond to that. Or in addition to that, you want to ask for clarification. Hey, when you said this, this is what I heard. I just want to make sure that this is what you meant by this. And so the key thing is doing that only when the speaker is done. Don't interrupt with your point of view until it's your turn to speak. That's very important, because even if you're trying to do something like, oh, I don't want to lose that, wait until they're done, because when you interrupt the speaker, that's going to cause an emotional feeling on their part. And a lot of times that if they're already upset, that's not going to add to your cause, right? So don't interrupt, but then practice as needed those self-soothing techniques so that you can avoid additional emotional flooding.
Real quick point about that is that sometimes the reason that we interrupt is because we don't want to forget, or because we believe that the truth somehow will be lost. If I don't say it now, then the truth is going to be lost. And it really takes a lot of faith to just listen quietly. Like, you know what? If this is true, what I'm saying, what I have to say, what's on my heart, whatever, if it's true, then it'll still be true, even if somebody else says something different. And I can give them the floor and let them say that. And then when it's my turn to speak, I can say what's on my heart. But when we are listening, we're setting aside our feelings so that we can really take in what the other person is saying. So we can switch back and forth.
Right. And so switch back and forth about the same issue. Once you have played the role of the speaker, it's your turn to listen so that the person who was listening can then talk about their viewpoint of the issue. They can do the same thing. They can share what they were feeling about the issue, not you, right? And so go back and forth until you're able to move forward in the conversation in a reasonable way. And so this is important. It's very difficult to do. It'll feel very clinical in some sense, I'm sure, if you're not used to doing this. But this is proven to provide couples with better outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And, when the other person is done speaking, before you jump in, because remember, you're not taking notes just to prepare your rebuttal, right? But instead, you're taking notes so that you can better understand where they're coming from, what they were thinking, where their heart is at. That's why you're taking your notes. So before you jump in with, but beforehand, you're going to say, here's what I hear you saying, to make sure that you really do hear what they're saying, and then they know that you've heard them.
That's exactly right. So let's move on to the third principle. Thanks for hanging in there. I know this might be a lot. This third principle is let's improve the aftermath of a conflict, or what we call regrettable incidents, because not everything is about you did this to me and I was hurt because of an action from you, right? The passage here is 2 Samuel 6 that says, and Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Again, 2 Samuel 6, verse 23. This is the actual statement that the Bible uses to describe the aftermath of what was a terrible fight between David and Michal, actually. And so we'll explore that conflict in greater detail a little bit later in this lesson. But I wanted to point this out to you right now because unlike other passages that specifically say that God kept someone from having children, it's passages like Genesis chapter 20, verse 17 and 18, or 1 Samuel 1, 5, with Sarai and with Hannah specifically, the Bible does not say that here. And so while the possibility exists that God did close up Michal's womb, right, more natural explanation for this would be that David refuses to be intimate with her again, particularly after the flashpoint of this argument. And so it's a terrible aftermath of a very vicious fight. Many athletes will tell you, right, that the crucial element for success in their sport is the follow through, right? You could talk to someone who's good at basketball, talking about how they release their shot, or golf, or tennis, or other sports. Carrying the motion all the way through to the end is what gives us the best outcome. And so a key to thriving in our marriages is ending uncomfortable events really well.
All right, so consider this. How do you and your spouse typically end a conflict? Write that down for just a moment. How do you and your spouse typically end a conflict? So, what is your answer? Do you just move on to other things? Do you just kind of ignore what just happened in the room? Does one of you just kind of walk away and has to cool off? Does one person apologize? Or do both people apologize? Is there one person who tends to apologize first? Are the apologies general? Like, sorry about earlier. That's very, very general and vague. Or are they specific, such as, I was wrong to lash out at you and use words to hurt you, and I'm sorry. That was unfair of me and unloving. I let my emotions lead me, and I wasn't thinking about protecting you or working with you, and I won't do that again. Whoa, that's a radically different apology.
It's the aftermath that provides the emotional template that we tend to use going forward to associate what's going to happen with the next conflict. And so if you are someone that after a conflict with your spouse feels beat up, then we can start associating that with our future conflicts, and it starts affecting the level of hope of resolution and even our willingness to try to resolve a conflict in the future. And so it's not just the conflicts that we have to consider. From time to time, there are regrettable incidents. What are these? Well, these are things that tend to happen that cause tension, but we may not necessarily be fighting about them, right? Often these are things that one spouse or the other does that are costly or embarrassing. Things like, I got a speeding ticket, right? Or, I didn't get a speeding ticket.
I got this.
Or forgetting an anniversary, or one spouse purchases a big item without talking about it. Or you do something that you don't even realize that's embarrassing to your spouse in public. Whether it's a conflict that's sort of traditional where we are fighting with each other, or it's a regrettable incident, these can be very difficult to move forward from. And so during these conflicts or regrettable incidents, we can tend to leave each other with a number of emotional injuries that don't really heal, especially because we continue to re-injure those same emotional feelings, right, in the next conversation when we have our next conflict.
Yeah. So what we have to do is remember that the really significant things that we don't resolve tend to become a third person in our future conversations, an unseen but influential participant in each of our conflicts. Let me ask you, have you ever had a conversation with someone but never actually spoken to the person? Like, you can speak to them about other things, but in your mind, maybe when you go to bed, you're actually having this conversation back and forth with them. It is about something that happened long ago. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, this unresolved conflict becomes a third person who reminds us of our hurts. And that's one way that sometimes it can pop up. It reminds us of our hurts, our pains, unhappy history, anything that we've experienced in our marriages.
All right, and the fourth principle is to create rituals of connection. And I love this scripture reference in Genesis chapter 26, verse 8. It says, when Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife, Rebekah. I love this passage because it talks about sort of the generational nature of a lot of our behaviors, right? And that's a whole nother class. But, just like his father did, Isaac married a beautiful woman, and just like his father did, he lies. He asks her to lie by asking her to pretend to be a sister in a tight situation. But, there is emotional automaticity here, right? Isaac had rituals of connection that he could not hide. And even though he's fearful, he's afraid for his life, his habit is what eventually causes him to be exposed as Rebekah's husband. Abimelech says, hey, wait a second, he's doing that. But I bet probably Isaac wasn't even aware that he was doing that because this was an automatic thing. And so the way God designed us is to create habits. And we want to cultivate habits that involve deliberate connection with our spouses, particularly connecting with each other in ways that feel very safe and incredibly nurturing.
Yeah, and it can start with something super small and then just build. Talking for 5 to 10 minutes about our day. It really can be anything. It could be a physical gesture. It could be a verbal interaction. The goal is to build on that in meaningful ways so that each of you find yourself looking forward to it. Some of ours are, it doesn't matter what time Reuben goes to it doesn't matter what time Reuben goes to bed. He gets up really early. I get up at 6 a.m. and I'm like, that's early enough. Thanks. He's already up and he's downstairs in the dining room or kitchen or whatever. But one habit that we have is we hug each other in the morning at the first time we see each other. And another is I love Instagram. And so Ruben's never on Instagram, but I love when I find these stories that are just, touch your heart or funny or whatever. And I share those with him. Ruben is always checking in with me during the day. If he's out we have this other office, if he's out at that office during the day, he'll just check in and send text messages or phone calls just so that I can feel like I'm still with him. He gives me back scratches, which is an important thing in marriage. Also, we'll go to bed at the same time. Sorry, I'm laughing because it sounds like I really need a lot of sleep, but I do. Anyway, we'll go to bed at the same time. So if he's staying up later than I am, if I'm going to bed, I'm like, hey, every night he checks with me to find out what time you're going to bed. I think I'm going to probably go to bed at 10:30. Okay, I'll come up and lay down with you. So he'll come up and lay down with me until I fall asleep, and then he gets back up and does whatever he needs to do before he gets up before me. I'm not sure how all that works. Anyway, but there's small things that it's like, hey, that's a way we connect. That's a way we connect all the time. You look forward to them and they become precious to you. And this is particularly important after a time of conflict because it can signal a return to normal, really a return to safety. And so, for instance, if we had a conflict earlier in the day and then Ruben never said, hey, what time are you going to bed? I would feel like, he still hates me or something. I would not feel connected.
All right, let's take a look at a biblical case study. And this is one of my favorites to examine because it really incorporates sort of what not to do, basically in terms of the things that we've been sharing with you today. And this is David and Michal, right? 2 Samuel 6, if you want the whole context, I would go back and read the entire chapter. But for right now, we're just going to look at verses 20 through 23. It says in verse 20, when David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Now, so let's take a look at this scene here. This is this married couple in the Bible. How could this scene have had a better outcome? What caused it to be so challenging? Well, here are some things I want you to consider. One is David comes home to bless his household. Again, if you know the story, David is bringing the ark back after a lot of challenges, difficulties, and drama. He's bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, and he's coming home after this great celebration to bless his household. But he's coming home after giving significantly to everyone else. And so Michal was obviously not with David during those proceedings. She's only watching from a distance. David's got great intentions, right? But how could things have been different if he actually started by blessing his family, or if he had included her in some of the processional or some of the proceedings, right? And maybe he did, and we don't know if she refused, right? But still, when he comes home after everything else and gives her to give his family, again, a lot of times we can look at that and think, I'm getting the leftovers. I'm getting what's only the residue of what everybody else received. She has, for her part, what we've talked about earlier, the harsh startup. It's not, hey, how's it going? Can I talk to you for a little bit about something that's on my mind or that I'm upset about? Man, she's like, boom, she hits him right there, right where it hurts. This is designed to wound in the most effective way possible. And so she's not vulnerable, right? She doesn't say, I feel bad about blank, right? It's also not constructive. It would really help me if you would blank. She doesn't do those things. And so harsh startups, if you've got a harsh startup in your marriage, if that's something typical, then that is a key indicator that your marriage needs help. David, for his part, the man after God's own heart, he attacks in response. He's like, are you? Did you come? What? Oh, okay. I got something for you. Let's talk about your dad, right? Like the fact that God didn't choose him or anybody else in your household. He chose me. And guess what? And he escalates, right? Because I'm going to become even more undignified than this girl, right? You haven't seen anything. Half naked, vulgar. Oh, no. I'm going to get full naked, completely vulgar, right? And so it's totally intense what he does as the man after God's own heart.
And, you think about the point we mentioned earlier, the principle we mentioned earlier about either image or instinct. Both of them are acting on instinct, aren't they? They both treat each other with contempt, and the aftermath is brutal. There's no stated forgiveness or resolution. And who's the third person in this situation? Reminder, the third person is a separate issue in the room with you that influences your current conversation. What was the third person here? In 2 Samuel 3, Michal was happily married to someone else. But because David wanted her back as his condition to assume control over all of Israel, he has her forcibly taken from her husband. And that husband loved her. He follows her weeping along the road until finally he's told that he's going to be killed if he doesn't turn back. So this is important because Michal isn't waiting for David to return. She had moved on with her life. He disrupts her life and completely just taking her away from it. So when they were married before, when David and Michal were married before, she was the only wife. Now she's back with David again, and now she's just one of several wives, essentially a concubine.
So let's end with some closing thoughts and just a few takeaways that we want to highlight for you. One, just remember, this is about thriving in our marriage. And so if we're going to thrive, there's a number of things that can help us, even beyond what we've shared here. But what we've shared here are, let's cultivate admiration, not contempt. And this is something we have to be very deliberate about, because if we don't cultivate admiration, what becomes unspoken, we leave for our spouses to fill in the blanks. And we may say, oh, I didn't want you to think that, or I didn't know you didn't feel loved. But if we don't continually fill in that blank with, I want you to feel loved, I want you to feel admired, they're going to fill in the blanks with something else. And if they're feeling low or if they're feeling discouraged, they might fill in that blank with something you don't want them to. So in our conflicts, let's just fight because we're going to, but let's fight as people who are made in God's image, not fight on the basis of instinct. I'm hurt because of what you said. And then that becomes the back and forth. And we're now moving very far away from where we started or where we hope to be in the conversation. Let's improve the aftermath of our conflicts. That's super important because, again, it's going to cause us to develop emotional templates that we are going to use going forward to think about what the next conflict will probably be like. And then finally, let's create and build on rituals of connection.
Man. So that's kind of a lot of material, or it can feel like a lot of material. To try to consider, how am I going to apply all that? Oh my goodness sakes. Okay, so you could think about what is one area that you see, oh yeah, that one, that was a weakness. Just take time to process the lesson with your spouse, learn what they got from it, what stood out, share about what stood out to you. Anything mentioned in that is true in your marriage, or perhaps when you heard it, it caused you to feel a bit exposed. How can you begin to change together, and what other couple can you talk to help you in these areas? You could even, right now, today, you could put a date on the calendar that's maybe 2 or 3 months from now, when you can follow up with each other about your progress, or even follow up with the couple that is helping you out. You know, as with any other aspect of our life, we see growth when we plan time to assess and reassess.